a jury has returned guilty verdicts on 5 of those 6 counts. Now, just to remind you, Ghislaine Maxwell was facing charges relating to grooming and trafficking underage girls for the late financier, her former partner Jeffrey Epstein, and the outcome of the jury deliberations means that she may face up to 70 years in prison. Let's bring in our North America correspondent Nomia Iqbal. What more do we know at this stage, Nomia?
Yes, after nearly 6 full days of deliberation by the jury here in New York, they have returned those verdicts. As you said there, they have found her guilty, Ghislaine Maxwell, on most of the counts. Let me just go through them. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, not guilty. And count 3 to count 6, guilty. The most serious charge, as you mentioned there, carries a jail sentence of up to 40 years. Now, I just want to remind people of what the jury had to decide here. The jury had to decide this. Were Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, the billionaire financier, the convicted sex offender who's now dead, partners in crime, or was she a scapegoat for his crimes? And that latter point is certainly what the defence had focused their strategy on. They had said Ghislaine Maxwell was an innocent woman, and that after Epstein had killed himself in jail 2 years ago whilst awaiting his own sex trafficking trial, the government had gone after her because they couldn't go after him. They said that she was being used as some sort of proxy through which the accusers of Epstein could have their day in court. Now, for the prosecution, it was a very different case they presented to the jury. They said regardless of what happened to Epstein 2 years ago, Ghislaine Maxwell was independently guilty and culpable and therefore worthy of being prosecuted and convicted for her crimes. They say she was not an innocent woman, an innocent bystander, as the defence had maintained, that someone who was an employee who was in and out of Epstein's life. They say that she was integral to the abuse that took place. They described her in court as a sophisticated and dangerous predator who lured in these very young, naive women into this lurid and lascivious and luxurious world that her and Jeffrey Epstein lived in, and that they were then trapped in this cycle of sexual abuse that lasted for years. Now, the only time that Maxwell did speak in court during the trial, it was only to the judge, was to say that she would not take to the stand to defend herself because she said that the government had not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. But in the last few minutes, we've heard from the jury. They have rejected that argument by the defence, and they have brought back to the prosecution's case. They believe that Ghislaine Maxwell knowingly did get involved in the crimes that she was accused of. But just to remind you, she was found not guilty on the second count, which was enticing a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts. Now, in terms of the sentencing, she is facing up to 40 years for the most serious charge. She turned 60 on Christmas Day, so she is now facing being locked up for the rest of her life.
Just to remind viewers who are just joining us that the breaking news of the jury in New York finding the British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell guilty on 5 of the 6 charges. They found her guilty of having helped the late financier Jeffrey Epstein to sexually abuse teenage girls, and they found her guilty on 4 other counts. Nomia Iqbal is our correspondent there for us, covering the trial and has been over the past weeks. Nomia, there have been many dramatic moments in the trial, but none more so than when we heard from Ghislaine Maxwell's family around the trial that they pledged to be there every day of it because they were worried about her mental health.
Yes, and they have been. They have been in the actual courtroom there to support her. And it's interesting, when you're in the courtroom, you see that Ghislaine Maxwell has been very animated throughout the trial. She writes notes, she observes everything, and then those notes, we believe, are passed through her attorneys to her family. They have been always there fighting for her. They believe which is her defence, which has been her defence, that she is innocent. They say that she is being persecuted because Epstein is no longer here to answer for his crimes, and they say that, as I mentioned, that she's being used as some sort of proxy through which the women have tried to have their say in court, their day in court. But the prosecution, they built their case on the testimonies of 4 women, and not all 4 women gave their names. There was only one woman who made her identity public during the trial, Annie Farmer, but the other 3 women went by a pseudonym or their first name, and these charges related, they stretch back decades, from 1994 to 2004, during that period, and we heard some very extraordinary detail by these women, and they portrayed Ghislaine Maxwell as this real chief enabler in all of this. They said that they built this relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell in which they were then convinced to then have this relationship with Epstein, that she set up these sexual massages, that went on to be sexual in nature. But just to remind people who are tuning in that Ghislaine Maxwell, after a 3-week trial, has been found guilty on most of the charges that she was facing, 6 charges in total, being found not guilty on a second count. We are yet to hear what the defence has to say, but we are expecting them to appeal, of course.
And Nomia, I understand there were several moments where journalists and others covering the trial were called back in, not knowing whether the jury had reached a verdict or not, but on several occasions the jury wanting more details and asking for transcripts and so on, to the extent that they weren't able to reach a verdict before Christmas. They took a break and then resumed their deliberations.
That's right. The jury has been had asked a lot of questions to the judge. Even today, they were asking to see the testimony again of some of the witnesses. They asked to see the testimony of all the 4 women at the heart of the prosecution's case. At the start of the week, they even asked for office supplies. They asked for highlighters and a whiteboard. So there was a real sense that this jury were really engaged in all of this. So before Christmas, they had an opportunity to sit before Christmas, but they declined that, saying they wanted to go and have their Christmas plans and then they would return. Even today in court, they asked the judge to clarify if they would have to sit over the New Year period and over the weekend. But Judge Alison Nathan has been very conscious of 2 things. First of all, the rise in Omicron cases here. They have skyrocketed in New York, and she was worried that someone could fall ill. And of course, if anyone in the jury fell ill, that would have an impact, and you'd have to then start bringing in alternate jurors, which would essentially mean the deliberations would have to start from scratch again. So she was conscious of that thing, but she was also conscious of not rushing the jury, and the defence have been very conscious of that as well. When I was in court earlier, the defence did say to the judge to emphasise that the jury cannot be rushed into a decision, and the judge had relayed that to them, and they certainly have been engaged. And this was a jury that was not going to be rushed in making their decisions. They have been thorough, they have taken their time, as you would expect them to do, because of course they had to deliberate the fate of Ghislaine Maxwell. They had to decide what would happen to her, and now, as we know, they have come to their verdict.
I suppose, Nomia, two very different images were put forward of Ghislaine Maxwell. The prosecution portraying her as a sophisticated predator, while the defence sought to portray her as a victim of Jeffrey Epstein's being kept in the dark, and that she was being charged for things that Jeffrey Epstein did. And as it turns out, the version that the jury agreed with was that of sophisticated predator.
That's right, and it's worth remembering that Ghislaine Maxwell is someone that was well known before she met Epstein. That it's thought they met in the early 1990s and went on to have this long association that lasted more than 25 years, right up until the point when he died, killed himself 2 years ago. She is the daughter of Robert Maxwell, the disgraced media tycoon. She was largely raised in England, well educated, went to Oxford University, spoke many fluent languages. She has a UK, US, French passport, and there are so many deep dives that have been done into her and her relationship with Epstein. If you go online and search this, there's so many of them. And what you hear about her, and you've seen all the photos of her, that this was a woman who was incredibly sophisticated, incredibly glamorous, and she lived this refined lifestyle, and that, just the way she looked, a very sort of unfussy, confident woman, elegant woman. And the prosecution say this is how she managed to beguile so many young, innocent girls who looked up to her and wanted access to that elitist world that she lived in. And they also go on to say that all those characteristics about her is exactly what attracted Epstein to her. Now, he may have been rich, but he didn't have access to that socially elevated world that she lived in. He was someone who was ruthlessly ambitious, the story goes, and he wanted to have legitimacy. And he wanted mobility amongst those upper classes with lots of money. And that's how they had this friendship. She was the person who helped to induct him into those really high circles in British society. And he notably, infamously, was friends with the Duke of York, Prince Andrew, the second son of Queen Elizabeth. But also the couple went on to rub shoulders with many high-profile people. Talk about powerful people. Some of their names were mentioned in court by his former pilot. We're talking about former presidents, Donald Trump, Bill Clinton as well. But the defence argued that actually Epstein was already in his own right a very charismatic, charming man, and that is why lots of women were attracted to him anyway. They tried to portray that he might have had a life with Maxwell, but he compartmentalised so much of it that there was so much that Maxwell didn't know about him, that she wasn't aware of what he was doing. But that narrative has largely been rejected by the jury today.
OK, Nomia, thank you very much indeed. Nomia Iqbal there for us on the Ghislaine Maxwell verdicts.